The sausage laws, how medieval food purity codes became instruments of state terror. The smell hit you before you saw anything. A sweetness that wasn't sweet at all, something biological and wrong, drifting from beneath the stretched casings hanging in a row at the butcher's stall. Flies circled in the thick summer air of a 13th century German market square. Customers haggled, children dodged between carts, and the stone buildings pressed the heat and the stench into a corridor with no relief. Then the crowd noticed the figure at the edge of the square, the city inspector flanked by 2 guild officials, and a silence moved through the market like a blade drawn slowly across a throat. The butcher's hands went still. The woman counting her coins stopped mid-sentence. Everyone understood what an inspection could mean. We tend to think of food safety regulations as bureaucratic, even boring. Fill out the form, pass the audit, move on. But the medieval purity laws governing sausage production in the German-speaking territories were nothing of the sort. They began, as most authoritarian frameworks do, with a legitimate crisis. People were dying from what they ate, and no one could trust what was inside a casing. The response, however, metastasized far beyond public health. What emerged was a system of surveillance, social control, and lethal punishment that turned an everyday market transaction into a potential death sentence, not for the consumer, but for the accused maker. These were not regulations. They were instruments of terror dressed in the language of civic welfare. To understand how a sausage law could ruin or end a life, you have to understand the world that demanded one in the first place, the rotten reality. Why the laws were initially demanded. Medieval German cities were growing faster than their infrastructure could handle. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, urban populations swelled as peasants fled the land for the promise of trade and wages. What they found instead were cramped, filthy streets where sanitation was an afterthought, and food supply chains ran on trust, a currency in dangerously short supply. There was no refrigeration, no standardized measurement, no centralized authority capable of inspecting every stall, every casing, every carcass dragged through the city gate at dawn. Into this vacuum stepped opportunism. Sausage, by its very nature, was the perfect vehicle for fraud. The casing hid everything. A butcher who couldn't sell his aging cuts before they turned could grind them down, pack them into intestine, season them heavily with pepper or garlic, and sell the result as fresh product. But spoiled meat was just the start. Producers routinely bulked out their sausages with whatever was cheap and available. Sawdust, breadcrumbs, ground bone, organ meat from diseased animals, rendered fats of uncertain origin. The customer buying a link at market had no way to know what was inside until they bit into it, or until their body told them hours later. And the body's response could be catastrophic. Foodborne illness in this period was not a mild inconvenience. Without clean water, without medicine, a bout of severe intestinal distress could kill, particularly among the very young, the elderly, and the already malnourished urban poor, who depended on cheap sausage as a primary source of protein. The pathogens lurking in improperly handled or deliberately adulterated meat, from bacterial infections to parasitic contamination, were invisible and poorly understood. What people understood was simpler and more visceral. You ate the wrong sausage, and you might not recover. This bred a specific kind of urban paranoia. Neighbors suspected butchers. Butchers suspected rivals of undercutting them with cheaper, more dangerous product. Customers suspected everyone. The marketplace, supposed engine of civic prosperity, became saturated with mutual distrust. Petitions reached city councils. Something had to be done. The crisis was real. The suffering was real. But the solution that authorities crafted would prove to be something far more ambitious than protecting stomachs. The fear already loose in the streets was not a problem to be solved. It was a resource to be harnessed. The rise of the sausage sentinel, guilds as secret police. The butchers' guilds had existed for decades before the purity laws. Their original purpose was mundane: regulate apprenticeships, set fair prices, maintain standards that kept the trade respectable. A guild master was a businessman, a mentor, a civic figure. He settled disputes between journeymen. He ensured that new entrants paid their dues. He was, in the most boring sense of the word, an administrator. The purity laws turned him into something else entirely. Once city councils mandated formal inspections of sausage production, they needed enforcers. Hiring new officials cost money. Training them took time. The guilds were already organized, already embedded in every market square and slaughterhouse in the city. They had the expertise to identify adulterated product. They knew how a proper casing should look, how fresh filling should smell, how the color of ground meat changed as it aged. So the councils deputized them. Guild masters and their appointed inspectors received the authority to enter any workshop at any time and examine any product. They could seize stock. They could levy fines. They could, with a single unfavorable report, trigger proceedings that ended in public punishment. This was no longer trade regulation. This was surveillance infrastructure dressed in an apron. The inspections themselves were deliberately intrusive. An inspector did not simply glance at a finished sausage hanging in a stall. He could demand to see the raw materials before they were ground. He could examine the salt, the spices, the casings. He could question apprentices about their master's methods, effectively recruiting the workforce as informants against their own employers. The power asymmetry was total. A guild inspector's judgment about a link of sausage was functionally unchallengeable. If he declared a product impure, the burden fell on the accused butcher to prove otherwise, an inversion of justice that made the inspector's opinion equivalent to a verdict. And the consequences of that verdict were not abstract. A finding of adulteration could mean the destruction of an entire shop's inventory, financial ruin delivered in an afternoon. Repeat offenses, or offenses deemed severe enough, could escalate to corporal punishment or worse. A man's livelihood, his family's survival, his standing in the community, all of it balanced on a guild master's cursory assessment of color and smell. The system rewarded zealotry. Inspectors who found violations demonstrated their usefulness to the council. Inspectors who found nothing risked appearing negligent. The incentive structure bent inevitably toward suspicion, toward finding fault, toward treating every butcher as a potential criminal until his sausage proved otherwise. What had started as a reasonable response to a genuine public health crisis had, within a generation, produced a network of empowered informants and inspectors whose reach extended into every corner of the meat trade. The guilds did not think of themselves as secret police. They did not need to. The structure they operated within did the work for them. Once this surveillance infrastructure was in place, firmly rooted and broadly accepted as necessary, the authorities recognized something the butchers themselves were only beginning to sense. These civil regulations could be sharpened into instruments of existential dread, the architecture of paranoia. The surveillance did not stay in the butcher's stall. It seeped outward into the streets, through the walls of private homes, and into the rhythms of daily life until the entire city felt like a space under observation. Consider the position of an ordinary resident of a 14th century German market town. You are not a butcher. You do not sell sausage. You have no direct stake in the meat trade. And yet the inspection regime touches you. Your neighbor, a pork seller, has been visited twice this month by the guild inspector. You watched from your doorway as the inspector's assistant carried out a tray of links for examination in the open street, where anyone could see. The message was not subtle. The authorities wanted you to see. They wanted the spectacle of scrutiny to become as familiar as the smell of smoke from the tannery. The inspection of food was, by design, a public act. Stalls were examined in full view of customers. Goods deemed suspect were confiscated openly, sometimes destroyed on the spot. A butcher's shame became the neighborhood's entertainment, and also its warning. You learned, without anyone telling you directly, that the boundaries of acceptable commerce were thin, arbitrary, and enforced by people who answered to the city council rather than to any principle you could predict. This public theater of enforcement had a secondary function. It made informants of everyone. Guild statutes in several German cities explicitly encouraged citizens to report suspected adulteration. You did not need to be an expert in spice ratios or casing quality. A vague suspicion, an odd smell from a neighbor's kitchen, a whispered comment at the well about a butcher cutting costs, any of these could initiate an inspection. The system did not require proof from the accuser. It required only a claim, and the machinery of investigation would grind forward on its own momentum. The psychological weight of this arrangement fell hardest on those who worked with meat, but it pressed on everyone who lived near them. A butcher facing inspection had every reason to wonder which of his neighbors had spoken to the guild. A neighbor who had said nothing still knew that others might assume he had. Trust corroded quietly. Social bonds that had sustained urban communities for generations developed hairline fractures under the pressure of a system that treated suspicion as civic duty. Even the private hearth was not safe. Inspectors in some jurisdictions held the right to enter homes where meat processing was suspected, examining not just commercial products, but household stores. The woman salting pork for her family's winter supply could, in theory, face the same scrutiny as the professional butcher. The line between domestic life and regulated commerce dissolved whenever an inspector decided to cross it. This was the architecture's true achievement. It did not need to catch every violation. It did not even need to find many. It needed only to make the possibility of being caught feel omnipresent, to ensure that every transaction involving meat carried a faint undercurrent of risk. The town square, once a place of commerce and community, became a stage where the state's power to scrutinize, to judge, to punish was performed daily in the language of sausage casings and spice measurements. When that power found its full legal expression, the consequences stopped being merely financial. From fines to the block, the lethality of law. The earliest penalties for selling adulterated sausage were unremarkable. A fine, confiscation of goods, perhaps a temporary ban from selling at market. These were the tools of commercial regulation, proportional and predictable. But what happened across the 13th and 14th centuries in German cities was a deliberate, systematic escalation that turned trade infractions into crimes against the public body, punishable by humiliation, exile, and death. The pivot point was language. Once municipal codes began describing the sale of spoiled or adulterated meat not as fraud, but as poisoning the public, the legal character of the offense changed entirely. A butcher who padded his sausages with offal or old scraps was no longer a cheat. He was a poisoner, and poisoners did not pay fines. Public shaming came first, and it was engineered for maximum psychological damage. Accused sausage makers were paraded through the streets, sometimes forced to wear their spoiled goods around their necks, sometimes locked in a pillory at the very market square where they had once sold their wares. The audience was not incidental. The entire point was the audience. Neighbors, customers, fellow guild members stood and watched as the state dismantled a person's reputation in real time. The message was not subtle. This is what happens when you fail to meet the standard we have set for you. But shaming was only a way station. For those accused of repeated offenses, or for cases where illness or death could be even loosely attributed to their products, the penalties climbed toward the irreversible. Banishment stripped a craftsman of his livelihood, his social network, his place in the only world he knew. An execution, carried out publicly, converted the butcher's body into a teaching instrument for the entire city. Intent barely mattered. A sausage maker whose product spoiled because of summer heat, or whose supplier delivered tainted meat without his knowledge, faced the same framework of accusation as one who deliberately substituted rancid fat to save a few coins. The law did not distinguish between negligence, bad luck, and malice. It distinguished only between compliance and non-compliance, and it treated non-compliance as an attack on the civic order itself. This collapsed the distance between an honest mistake and a capital crime. The effect on the butcher class was paralyzing. Every batch of sausage carried not just commercial risk, but existential risk. Every casing filled was a wager that no inspector would find fault, that no neighbor would lodge a complaint, that no customer would fall ill from causes unrelated to the product and blame the meat anyway. The state did not need to execute many butchers to achieve this effect. A single public execution rippled outward through the entire guild system, through every market town that heard the story. Fear scales efficiently. One body on the block purchased compliance from thousands of hands that would never touch the blade. These extreme measures ultimately left a lasting, dark mark on the culture of German craftsmanship. The obsessive precision that would come to define the guild tradition, the almost religious devotion to specification and standard, did not emerge from pride alone. It was forged in a system where the penalty for falling short was not a poor reputation, but a short life. What began as a reasonable impulse, the desire to keep spoiled meat from killing townsfolk, calcified into something far more deliberate and far less concerned with safety than with submission. The purity laws did not simply regulate sausage, they regulated people. They turned every market stall into a site of potential accusation, every transaction into evidence, every neighbor into a possible informant. The machinery of inspection was not built to protect the butcher, or even, in any meaningful sense, the consumer. It was built to remind every craftsman, every morning he opened his shop, that the state was watching and that its patience was finite. When a society decides that the surest path to safety runs through fear, it is never the powerful who walk that path. It is the man with his hands in the casing, hoping today is not the day someone decides he has fallen short. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe. Your support helps Baron Bratwurst continue exploring and documenting the history, culture, and stories behind the world's most fascinating sausages. And if you have your own recommendations, stories, or suggestions for future episodes, please leave them in the comments below. There is always another sausage story waiting to be told.